The ceramic plate was warm in her hands when the glob of spit landed on it. Nadia didn't flinch, didn't scream, didn't drop it. She stood in the back corridor of Mireille, the most expensive restaurant in the city, in her white server's uniform and her worn-down flats, and she stared at what Chef Bastien had just done, right in front of 3 kitchen staff who immediately looked away, right in front of the security camera mounted in the corner, right in front of God and every consequence that would follow. The table awaiting that plate, table 7, private dining room. A man who ate here in silence every Friday night, who never looked at the staff, who had ordered nothing changed in 14 months. She didn't know what he owned yet. That information would come later all at once, like a wall collapsing. Right now, she only knew 2 things. 1, she had $11.43 in her bank account, and her landlord had slid a 30-day notice under her door that morning. 2, she was going to take this plate back to the kitchen, scrape it clean herself, and say nothing. Because that was what invisible women did. That was what women with nowhere else to go did. That was what she had been doing for 26 years. She turned toward the kitchen. She never made it. Don't. The voice came from the end of the corridor. Low, quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the walls. Nadia froze. She turned slowly, the soiled plate still in her hands, and saw him for the first time up close, the man from table 7. Standing in the corridor in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her rent for 3 months, with gray eyes that didn't blink and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from something harder than bone. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the plate. Then those gray eyes moved slowly, deliberately to the kitchen door, to Chef Bastien, who had just realized he had an audience. The color left Bastien's face so completely it was almost beautiful. Sir, she was late with the... Don't speak. Still that same quiet, more dangerous than shouting. The man's gaze came back to Nadia then, and for one suspended, airless moment, he looked at her the way no one had looked at her in years. Not through her, at her. Like she was the only real thing in the hallway. His jaw tightened. What's your name? Her mouth was dry. $11.43 her brain supplied helpfully. 30 days. Nowhere to go. Nadia, she said. Nadia Voss. Something shifted in his expression. A crack in the stone, too fast to name. Nadia, he said it once, like he was locking it away somewhere. Then he reached into his jacket pocket slowly, the way powerful men moved when they wanted you to know they weren't in a hurry, and placed a single card on the shelf beside her. No name on it, just a number. Be at this address tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. He turned to leave, paused. Bring your resignation letter. She opened her mouth. I need this job. You'll be paid 4 times what this place pays you. His back was already to her. Don't be late. He walked away. Nadia stood in the corridor, holding a spat-on plate in one hand and a mystery card in the other, with no idea that the man who just changed her life had owned this restaurant for 7 years, or that his name was on the deed of the building she lived in. Or that the legal document, still sitting in a locked drawer in his office, the one his lawyers had filed 18 months ago and never told him to act on, listed her as his wife. If this story already has your heart racing, hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter. And drop in the comments, what would you have done with that plate? I read every single one. Let's begin. Nadia Voss had a system for bad days. She kept a notebook cheap, spiral bound, the kind that cost 99 cents at the pharmacy on the corner, and every time something went wrong, she wrote it down, not to remember it, to close it, to put it somewhere outside her chest where it couldn't keep pressing on her ribs at 2 a.m. Tonight's entry would be long. She rode the subway home with her server's apron folded in her lap and the card tucked inside her bra because her uniform had no pockets, and she stared at the dark tunnel walls rushing past the window and did the math she did every night. The math that never added up. Rent, $1,340. Due in 30 days per the notice. Bank account, $11.43. Paycheck from Mireille, if she didn't lose her job after tonight, $487 after taxes. Shortfall, $841.57. She'd borrowed from her friend Celeste twice already this year. Celeste had stopped answering calls about money, which Nadia didn't blame her for. You could only watch someone drown so many times before the weight started pulling you under too. There was no one else to call. Her mother had died 4 years ago, breast cancer, fast and merciless. 6 months from diagnosis to the funeral, where Nadia stood alone in the rain because her father had left when she was 9 and she hadn't bothered tracking him down to tell him. Her older brother Marcus had his own family in Phoenix, his own mortgage, his own quiet exhaustion. She'd called him twice in the last year. He'd called back once. 26 years old. One bedroom in a building that smelled like mildew and someone else's cooking. A job waiting tables at a restaurant where the chef had just spat on the food she was carrying because she'd asked him politely to replate a dish that had been sitting under the heat lamp for 11 minutes too. Long. A table waiting. A customer who would send it back if she served it cold. She'd been trying to do her job. Bastien had looked at her the way certain men had been looking at her whole life. You don't count. You don't matter. You are in my way. She was so tired of being in people's way. The card was still warm from her skin when she pulled it out in her apartment. She set it on the kitchen counter under the one bulb that worked and looked at it again. No name, no logo, no title, just a phone number and an address. A street in the financial district. The kind of block where the buildings had no signs and the windows reflected sky instead of interiors. Be at this address tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Bring your resignation letter. She should throw it away. She knew that. Every reasonable part of her brain, the part that had learned slowly and painfully that men who approached her in corridors offering things she needed were rarely offering them for free, said to throw it in the bin, go to bed, show up to Mireille tomorrow and pretend tonight hadn't happened. But she kept coming back to one detail. He hadn't looked at her like she was something he wanted. He'd looked at her like she was something he recognized. Like she'd answered a question he hadn't known he was asking. She turned the card over. Nothing on the back. 4 times your current salary. Even at 3 times her current salary, she could breathe. At 4 times, she could clear her debt from her mother's final hospital bills. $6,200, still sitting on a credit card at 22% interest, the number she didn't write in the notebook, because writing it made it more real. She could stop doing the math every night. She could sleep. She laid the card back on the counter. She opened her notebook, wrote, "A man gave me a card tonight. I don't know his name. I don't know what he does. I don't know what he wants." She stared at what she'd written. Then she wrote underneath it, "But I'm going." She set her alarm for 6:30 and spent 20 minutes the next morning standing in front of her half-empty closet, which told the same story her bank account did. She had 3 blouses that still looked professional if you didn't look too closely at the cuffs. She had 1 pair of black trousers without a visible stain. She had the flats she wore to Mireille and a pair of heels she'd bought second-hand for her mother's funeral and worn exactly once because they were half a size too small. She wore the heels. She could endure the pain for one morning. She typed her resignation letter on her phone on the subway, 1 paragraph, polite, no explanation, and emailed it to the restaurant manager at 7:51 a.m. Then she stood outside the address on the card in the financial district in front of a building with no sign and glass doors that reflected her back at herself. Small, pale, overdressed for a job interview in a building she didn't know the name of. You can still walk away, she thought. A man appeared on the other side of the glass. Not him, someone else. Broad, older, with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of stillness that came from years of watching rooms instead of participating in them. He opened the door. "Miss Voss." Not a question. "I'm Carver, Mr. Ashford's head of operations." He stepped back to let her in. "He's expecting you." Ashford, she thought, following him into the marble lobby. That's his name. She turned it over in her mind, testing the weight of it, the shape, as the elevator rose to the 14th floor and the doors opened onto a hallway that smelled like cedar and cool air and something quieter, harder to name. The kind of silence that belonged to people who didn't have to make noise to be heard. Carver stopped at a door at the end of the hall. He looked at her once, a brief, assessing glance, and then, unexpectedly, something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was close to one. "He interviewed 11 candidates for the position you're about to be offered," he said, his voice low. "Didn't hire any of them." Nadia blinked. "How long has the position been open?" 8 months. The door opened before she could process that. And there was the man from table 7, standing behind a desk that stretched the length of a wall, with the city laid out behind him through floor-to-ceiling glass like something he'd already bought and filed away. He wasn't looking at his phone, wasn't reviewing papers, wasn't doing what powerful men always did when they wanted you to know they were more important than you. He was just standing there, waiting. In the daylight, he was sharper than she remembered, older than she'd realized in the corridor, early 40s maybe. Dark hair with the first threads of gray at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been clenched for years and only recently decided to stop apologizing for it. And those eyes gray, still, with that unsettling quality of looking at instead of through. He noticed the heels. One quick downward glance, and she saw his jaw tighten in a way she couldn't interpret. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He stayed standing, which she noted. Men who stood while you sat were usually trying to make you feel small, but he didn't feel like that. He felt like a man who didn't know how to be still in a chair. Like the standing was just what he did. "Nadia Voss," he said. 26. Columbia University. 4 years ago, you were enrolled in their pre-law program. He paused. "You didn't finish." Her fingers tightened on her bag. "No," she said carefully. "I didn't. Your mother got sick. It wasn't a question. Second year." The floor felt like it shifted slightly. "You ran a background check." "I run background checks on everyone who enters this building." His voice was completely even. "What happened to the law degree?" "I left to take care of her." The words were practiced by now smooth, without the weight they used to carry. Then she passed. "Then I needed income faster than finishing a degree would provide. I've been working food service for 3 years. "You're not a server," he said. She looked at him. "I've been serving tables for." "I know what you've been doing." I said, "You're not a server." He moved to the front of the desk, leaning against it with his arms crossed, and she understood then that this was how he conducted himself, always slightly too close, always slightly too direct. "You corrected the sommelier twice last Friday, and you were right both times. You handled the table 9 complaint about the wine reduction in 11 seconds without calling a manager. You've been solving problems that aren't your job to solve since you started at Mireille." Nadia went very still. He'd been watching her for weeks. At a restaurant he apparently owned. "I need an executive assistant," he said. "Someone who thinks faster than they're paid to, who doesn't collapse under pressure, and who has enough working knowledge of the law to understand the documents I put in front of them without requiring me to explain every clause." He looked at her steadily. "The 11 people I interviewed before you had the credentials. None of them had what you do." "What do I have?" she asked, because she genuinely didn't know the answer, and she needed to. Something moved through his expression. Brief, controlled, impossible to read. "Judgment," he said, "and the ability to be invisible when the situation requires it." She thought of 26 years of practice, of her father's back as he walked out, of hospital waiting rooms where she'd learned to take up as little space as possible, of table 9, of Bastien's face. Invisible, she thought. Yes, I've had a lot of practice. "What's the salary?" she asked. He told her. The number was so far beyond what she'd expected that she heard it, processed it, and then had to process it again. Not 4 times her Mireille wage, 7. Enough to clear the credit card in 6 months. Enough to rebuild. Enough to breathe. "You'd start Monday," he said. "The work is demanding. The hours are not always predictable. You'll sign an NDA that is, frankly, extensive." His eyes held hers. "And you'll have questions. About what I do, about this building, about certain aspects of the business." His jaw tightened, just slightly. "I'd prefer you ask me directly rather than form your own conclusions." "Are the conclusions people generally form about you accurate?" she asked. He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "Some of them," he said. She should have found that terrifying. She noted, distantly, that she did not. "I'll need to review the NDA before I sign it," she said instead. Something she couldn't name crossed his face. It was gone in an instant. "Carver will send it to you today." He straightened, moved back around the desk, the conversation apparently concluded in his mind, the decision apparently made. Monday, 8 o'clock. Nadia stood on legs that were perfectly steady, which surprised her. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. Mr. Ashford, he looked up. Yesterday in the corridor. Why did you come out of the private dining room? You never leave the table during service. 14 months, never once. The silence stretched 4 full seconds. I smelled something wrong, he said. His voice had changed quieter, stripped of its boardroom precision. In the kitchen, something that shouldn't have been happening. He meant Bastien. He meant what Bastien had done. He'd known before he even walked into that corridor. He'd come to see. Nadia looked at him for one more moment. Then she nodded once and walked out. In the elevator, she leaned against the wall and pressed her hand flat against her sternum, feeling her own heartbeat. He came out because something was wrong, she thought, and I was the something. She did not examine why that made the tightness in her chest loosen for the first time in months. She just let herself breathe. She sat down, not because he told her to, because her legs made the decision before her mind did, which she resented, but she was practical enough to accept it. Dominic did not move from behind his desk. He did not come around to sit beside her, did not attempt any of the physical gestures of comfort that people deployed when they needed to soften something unbearable. He stayed where he was, which she found, unexpectedly, easier to bear. She didn't want to be managed right now. She wanted information. Start from the beginning, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she was learning to read his silences, learning which ones meant I'm calculating and which meant I'm deciding how much to give you. This was the second kind. 5 years ago, he said, you were 21. Your mother had been diagnosed 6 months earlier. You were still enrolled at Columbia. He paused. A man named Raymond Holt was your mother's oncologist. Nadia went still. She knew that name. She had spent 4 years trying to make herself forget it. Holt had a pattern, Dominic continued, his voice completely level, the way a person spoke when they were controlling something with great effort. He identified patients whose families were financially vulnerable, women, usually young women, usually alone. He would offer to reduce or defer treatment costs in exchange for he stopped. His jaw tightened hard enough that she could see it from across the desk, in exchange for access. The room felt smaller. He approached you in October of that year, Dominic said. You were 21. Your mother's bills were already past $40,000. You had no cosigner for a payment plan. Holt told you that without the next round of treatment, your mother had approximately 10 weeks. Nadia's hands were folded in her lap. She looked at them. I know what he did, she said, her voice coming out quieter than she intended. I was there. I know you were. Dominic's voice shifted something in it, very briefly. That was not the boardroom voice, not the command voice, something rougher and lower. I became aware of Holt's activities through a separate matter, a business associate whose daughter he had also approached. A pause. I had certain resources that could have addressed the situation directly, but Holt had protection. He had relationships with people who ensured that direct action would create exposure I couldn't afford at that time. So, you found another way, Nadia said slowly. His pattern relied on the vulnerability of unmarried women, Dominic said. Women who had no legal protector. No one whose resources or reputation created risk for him. He looked at her steadily. A married woman, particularly a woman married to someone with my particular profile, was no longer a viable target. The legal and financial exposure to Holt was too significant. The silence that followed was very long. You married me, Nadia said, to make me legally inconvenient to a predator. Yes, without telling me. You were 21, under extreme duress, and you had a mother dying in a hospital. If I had approached you and said I would like to marry you on paper to protect you from your mother's doctor, you would have, he stopped. You would have said no, out of pride, out of not wanting to be indebted to a stranger. His eyes held hers. I calculated that you would rather suffer the danger than accept the help. The awful thing was that he was right. She knew with complete certainty that 21-year-old Nadia would have said no. How, she said carefully, did you marry me without my knowledge or consent? Something crossed his face. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated than guilt. The ceremony was performed while you were present, he said. You were not coerced. The details of how it was arranged are not something I'm proud of. A licensed officiant, documentation that was technically legal. You signed a paper you believed was a treatment cost deferral agreement. The room tilted slightly. I signed. She stopped. She remembered. A Thursday afternoon, a tired administrator at the hospital, a form on a clipboard that she'd skimmed authorization for financial arrangement, two-party agreement, and signed without reading in full because she'd been awake for 31 hours and her mother had just been told the cancer had reached her lymph nodes. She had signed her own marriage certificate thinking it was a payment plan. Holt withdrew his approach within 2 weeks, Dominic said quietly. Your mother received the next round of treatment at the standard rate. Her oncologist was replaced with a different physician shortly afterward. A pause. Holt resigned from the hospital 8 months later. He did not resign voluntarily. Nadia looked at the wall behind Dominic's head, at the city through the glass behind him, at the filing still open on his desk. And then, she said, and then your mother died, and you left Colombia, and you needed to work, and he stopped, seemed to choose his words. I kept track of you. I told myself it was to ensure you remained safe, that no one connected to Holt's circle targeted you in his absence. A pause that went on too long. That was not the only reason. You kept track of me for 4 years. Yes. You own my building. Yes. You own the restaurant where I worked. Yes. And then you manufactured a situation where I would walk into your building and you would offer me a job? She looked at him directly. Was any of it an accident? The corridor. Bastien. Any of it? Dominic held her gaze without flinching. Bastien is genuinely that kind of man, he said. I didn't arrange that. But when it happened, the muscle in his jaw moved. When I saw it happen, I came out of that dining room because I had been watching you work at that restaurant for 6 weeks, and you deserved better than what he did. And I was in a position to give you better. And he stopped. You decided, she said. I decided, he said. Nadia unclenched her hands in her lap. She pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed and did the thing she'd learned to do in hospital waiting rooms. The thing where you feel everything and show nothing and process it in order, step by step, instead of letting it all arrive at once. I need to understand something, she said. Right now, I am your employee. I have signed an NDA. I am also, apparently, your wife, which means I have rights you haven't told me about and obligations I didn't agree to. She looked at him. What do you want from me, Dominic? Not what you've done. What do you want now? The silence was different this time. Not calculating. Something more stripped down. I want, he said slowly, like a man handling something he didn't have practice with, to know if you'll stay. In this job. In this building. I want you to have the salary and the stability and the work that you should have had 4 years ago. A pause. And I want the opportunity to be someone you chose, rather than someone who chose for you. His voice had gone very quiet. I'm aware that is a great deal to ask. It's an extraordinary amount to ask, Nadia said. Yes. I'm not going to give you an answer today. I know. I'm going to go home. I'm going to think. And on Monday, if I come back. She stood, smoothed her trousers, picked up her bag. If I come back, we are going to have a second conversation in which you tell me everything. Not the summary, everything. Dominic stood when she stood, that automatic, old-fashioned response that she'd noticed all week, rising when she entered or left, something he seemed to do without thinking about it. Everything, he said. And the marriage document, she said. I want my own lawyer to review it. I'll send you a full copy tonight. She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, the same spot she'd stopped on her first day. She realized, the same posture, the same backward glance, like this doorway was becoming a place where she said the things she meant. Dominic, he looked at her. The coffee on Monday, the way it was made. She held his gaze. I know you told Carver how I take it. I know you noticed. She paused. That's either very thoughtful or very frightening, and I haven't decided which yet. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained and more genuine than a smile. Let me know when you decide, he said. She left. She spent the weekend dismantling herself and putting herself back together. Saturday, she walked, miles of it, through the city, with her hands in her pockets and her earphones in playing nothing, because she needed to hear herself think. She walked past the hospital where her mother had died, past the Columbia campus where she'd spent 2 years learning to read documents that were trying to tell her things she wasn't ready to hear, past the street where she'd first lived in the city at 19, with 2 roommates and a mattress on the floor, and the absolute certainty that she was going somewhere. She still was going somewhere. The destination had just changed without her input. Sunday, she read the marriage document. All of it. Then she called a legal aid lawyer she'd known from a campus clinic 4 years ago, a woman named Priya who was now at a mid-sized firm and who listened to the situation in silence and then said, very carefully, "Nadia, what he did is legally complicated and ethically I'm not going to pretend it's straightforward." A pause. "But the document itself is valid. You are, as things stand, legally married. Can I dissolve it? Yes, fairly easily. Given the circumstances of how it was formed, there's a strong argument for fraud in the inducement even if his intentions were protective. Any judge would look at this," and Priya stopped. "Do you want to dissolve it?" Nadia looked at the ceiling of her apartment. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Then don't do anything yet," Priya said. "Keep the document. Don't sign anything he sends you. And Nadia, be careful. Men who build entire architectures around a woman without her knowledge, even men who believe they're protecting her, that's a particular kind of person." A pause. "It's not always dangerous, but it's never simple." "No," Nadia said. "It's not." She showed up Monday at 7:52 a.m. Dominic was already in his office. He looked up when she passed the frosted glass. She didn't stop. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and picked up the red folder. At 8:07 a.m., a coffee appeared, oat milk, 1 sugar. At 8:09 a.m., she sent him a calendar invite for a meeting at 5 p.m. titled "The Full Account." His acceptance came back in 43 seconds. The floors he wasn't supposed to access contained, in order: Floor 12, a document archive. Physical copies of every contract, every acquisition, every negotiation Ashford Industries had conducted in its 11-year history, not digital. Paper, because paper could not be hacked, and because Dominic Ashford had learned early that the things worth protecting were the things you kept in forms that required physical presence to steal. Floor 11, a private security operation. 6 people, all former law enforcement or military, managing threat assessment for Dominic and his associated interests. This floor was the reason Carver had appeared in 4 minutes when she'd flagged Vance in the elevator. This floor was the reason she'd had a car waiting for her every evening this week before she'd even asked. Floor 10. Something he paused before naming. Floor 10, he said, is where I've been managing the Vance situation. She waited. Gerald Vance represents a consortium called the Meridian Group. She looked up sharply the same name as the logistics contract, the trap on page 7 that she'd caught on her first morning. They have been attempting to acquire my shipping infrastructure for 3 years. The shipping infrastructure is not for sale because it is not simply a logistics business. He paused. It moves other things. What other things? Evidence. He held her gaze. Documentation of financial crimes. Funds belonging to people who cannot access traditional banking systems. In some cases, people themselves. The room was very quiet. "You move people," she said slowly. "I move people who are in danger," he said, "through systems that would otherwise be unavailable to them. It is not," he stopped, seemed to choose his words with more care than usual. "It is not an operation that sits comfortably within standard legal definitions. But the alternative, for the people it serves, is considerably worse than whatever legal gray area I occupy." Nadia thought about Holt, about a young woman in a hospital corridor being told what she would need to give in exchange for her mother's survival. "How long?" she said. 7 years. Since a specific situation that made me aware of what certain kinds of protection could mean to people who had none." He paused. "The situation that brought me into contact with Holt's circle, initially. Someone you couldn't protect," she said. His jaw tightened. "My sister," he said, very quietly. She was 19. She was in a city where she didn't speak the language and she had no money, and she had a man who had taken her documentation. She could not contact me for 6 weeks because the systems that should have helped her instead made her more vulnerable." He stopped. "By the time I found her, she was safe. But those 6 weeks..." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the gray was very dark. "Those 6 weeks are why Floor 10 exists." Nadia did not move, did not fill the silence with the soft sounds of sympathy that people deployed to show they were listening. She just looked at him, and let him know she'd heard him, and waited. Vance's group wants the shipping infrastructure, Dominic continued, because it accesses territories and relationships they cannot buy or replicate. They have no interest in what it's used for. They would dismantle it and repurpose it for conventional logistics within a year. He paused. Everyone currently depending on it would lose their route. How many people? Currently active cases 43. He held her eyes. Pending a further 109. 152 people whose safety ran through this building. Through the floors she wasn't authorized to access. Through the man she'd accidentally married 5 years ago. Nadia breathed. And the marriage document, she said. The asset protection it creates, it protects the shipping operation. In the event of my death or incapacitation, without a legal heir or spouse, the assets can be seized and restructured through a probate process that Vance's legal team has already mapped out, Dominic said. With a valid marriage on record, the restructuring becomes significantly more complex. It buys time for the operation to be transferred to people I trust. And Vance knows this. Vance has worked it out, yes. Nadia stood. She walked to the window and looked out at the city and thought about the man in the elevator and the text message and the leak inside this building who had told someone her name. She thought about 152 people and 43 active cases and a 19-year-old girl who'd spent 6 weeks in a city where she couldn't ask for help. She thought about a 21-year-old woman in a hospital corridor signing a paper she hadn't read because she'd been awake for 31 hours. She turned around. I need you to hear something, she said. Dominic was watching her from the desk with that absolute attention. What you did 5 years ago was wrong, she said. Her voice was steady and direct. The method was wrong. Taking someone's agency, even to protect them, is wrong. I need you to understand that I know that, and I need you to know that I know that before anything else moves forward. I know it, he said. I have known it for 5 years. And what you did after the building, the restaurant, the watching that, is also something I have questions about that I am not done asking. I know that too. But, she paused. 152 people. She held his gaze. If Vance's group gets what they're pushing for, those people lose their route. Yes. Then we have a problem to solve. She walked back to the desk. Tell me about the leak. Who in this building knew my name before I walked through the door? Dominic's expression shifted, something settling in it. Something that looked like relief and something that looked like a man who had been carrying something alone for a long time and had just, for the first time, been offered help. Carver has a list of 4 people who had access to the file that contained your name before your hire was formalized, he said. I've been narrowing it. Share the list with me. She opened her laptop. I've been in this building for 2 weeks. I've been watching people the same way you watch things quietly, from a position that looks passive. I may have noticed something Carver hasn't. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and sent her a file. They worked until 9 p.m. Side by side, at his desk, her laptop open, his files spread between them, Carver joining for 40 minutes and then leaving again. She cross-referenced access logs with meeting schedules. She mapped who had been on which floor, on which day. She found 2 anomalies in the building's entry system that didn't match anyone's authorized movements, and when she put them in front of Dominic, his jaw tightened in a specific way she was beginning to understand meant, I see it and it's worse than I hoped. Marcus Reeve, she said. Floor 12, twice last month on days when he wasn't scheduled. He runs the document archive. He's been with me for 4 years. 4 years is long enough to be approached. She paused. Or to be waiting for the right moment. She looked at him. Has the Meridian Group made him an offer? Dominic was quiet. I'll find out, he said. At 9:15, she stood to leave. Carver was waiting in the lobby with a car. Dominic walked her to the elevator, something he hadn't done before, and stood in the hallway while the doors opened. Nadia. She looked at him. Thank you. The word seemed to cost him something. Not in a performed way, in the way of a man who didn't have much practice with it and was trying to get it right. Don't thank me, she said. I'm doing my job. The elevator doors began to close. You're doing considerably more than your job, he said. The doors closed. She rode down alone and thought about his face when he'd said those 6 weeks, the way it had gone very still and very dark. the way grief looked when it had been stored for a long time in a person who didn't know where else to put it. She thought, I should not be feeling what I am currently feeling about this man. She thought, I am going to feel it anyway. It was a Thursday, 3 weeks into her employment, that she found him in the archive. She'd come in early 7:15, the city still gray and cold outside, to finish a contract review before the 8 a.m. calls started. The building was quiet at that hour, the security desk staffed by a woman named Petra who greeted her by name now and buzzed her through without the usual check. Floor 14 was empty except for the hum of the ventilation and the ambient glow of the city through the windows. Dominic's office was dark. She was 20 minutes into her work when she heard a sound from the stairwell, barely audible, the kind of sound that a building made when someone was in it who was trying not to be noticed. She would have ignored it, except that on the floor plan Carver had given her during orientation, the stairwell on the north side of 14 connected directly to floor 12. She thought about Marcus Reeve. She got up. The stairwell door was unlocked. It was always unlocked from this side, she'd noted, in case of emergency. She pushed it open and listened. Nothing. Just the stairwell's echo and the sound of her own breathing. She went down one flight to 12. The archive floor was accessed by a keycard she technically didn't have authorization for, but she'd noticed 2 weeks ago that the door's magnetic seal had a 3-second delay on relocking after someone passed through from the other direction, a maintenance quirk that no one had gotten around to fixing. She waited. 40 seconds later, someone came through from the inside. Not Marcus Reeve. Dominic. He stopped when he saw her. His jacket was gone, just the white shirt, sleeves down for once, his hands empty. He looked for a disorienting moment, like someone she'd never seen before. Not the boardroom man, not the commanded and commanding presence she'd spent 3 weeks learning to read. Just a man in a stairwell at 7:30 inches the morning who'd been somewhere he hadn't told her about. You're here early, he said. So are you? She looked at him carefully. His eyes were tired in a way that was different from overwork, deeper, older. What's on floor 12 that you come to look at before the building opens? He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he stepped back and held the door. Come see, he said. The archive was exactly what he'd described. Rows of filing cabinets, physical documents in labeled folders, the smell of paper, and the particular stillness of a room full of records. But at the far end, behind a set of shelves that swung outward on a hinge, there was a smaller room she hadn't known existed. A room with a corkboard wall, photographs, printed documents, handwritten notes, names connected by lines. At the center of it, a photograph of a man she didn't recognize, 50-something, unremarkable. A school ID photograph from the look of it. Below it, in Dominic's handwriting, Holt. Raymond Holt. Around him, branching outward, 6 other names. Hospitals, cities, dates. He's still practicing, Nadia said quietly, under a different name. Dominic stood beside her, his arms at his sides. In 3 different states over the past 4 years. He resigned from St. Catherine's, but he didn't stop. A pause. There have been 4 more women I've been able to identify. Possibly more I haven't. Nadia looked at the board, at the names, at the dates. You've been building a case, she said. Attempting to. His voice was careful, controlled. The challenge is that the women, understandably, are reluctant to come forward. The nature of what he did ensures their silence is the condition under which they received what they needed. He is very good at that. A pause. At making the thing he takes, the same as the thing he gives. So that naming it as theft feels like naming yourself. Nadia was quiet. I know, she said softly. Dominic looked at her. I know because he did it to me too, she said. Not the same way, but the principle making the cost feel like a gift. Making the person who was wronged feel complicit. She paused. I didn't tell you that. On purpose. I've been trying to decide if you needed to know. The silence between them was very different from the silences she'd cataloged over 3 weeks. This one had a texture to it. I'm sorry, Dominic said. The 2 words came out stripped of everything. No framing, no qualification, no careful architecture. Just the words. Placed directly in front of her. She nodded, accepted them. You've been coming here in the mornings, she said, to look at this board. When I can't sleep. His jaw tightened briefly. Which is frequently. Because you can't get him. Because I have been trying for 5 years and the evidence is sufficient for a civil case and insufficient for a criminal one. And every time I move toward filing the civil case, I risk exposing the women further. And he stopped, ran his hand through his hair. I cannot find the mechanism that dismantles this without creating more harm in the process. Nadia looked at the board. She looked at the dates, at the hospital names, at the structure of what Holt had built, not the crimes themselves, but the infrastructure around them, the protection, the silence. The mechanism, she said slowly, is not a civil case. The mechanism is a regulatory investigation. She turned to look at Dominic. If the medical board in 3 states simultaneously receives documented complaints not from the women, but from administrative sources, billing anomalies, prescription irregularities, they open an investigation that doesn't require the women to be named or to testify at this stage. She paused. His license gets suspended while it proceeds. He can't practice, the harm stops, and the case builds over time with the women in control of whether and when they participate. Dominic was very still. That requires someone who understands the regulatory process well enough to identify the administrative anomalies and present them in the correct format for each state's board, he said. It requires a paralegal with 2 years of pre-law training, an obsessive eye for documents, and a very specific motivation, she said. He looked at her. In the small room behind the archive, with the corkboard wall between them and the city waking up far below, Dominic Ashford looked at Nadia Voss the way she had been looked at exactly once before in her life on the day she'd found the marriage document in his office. When she'd asked her a question and he'd said you and meant it like a complete answer. Like she was the thing that made sense of the rest. You would do this, he said, not a question. I'm already doing it, she said. I've been building the file for a week. I was going to tell you when it was ready. She paused. I wanted it to be ready before I told you. So you couldn't talk me out of it. I wouldn't have talked you out of it. You would have tried to manage it, to protect me from it. That's what you do. Her voice wasn't accusing, just direct, the way she always was with him, the way she'd noticed he responded to better than anything else. I don't need to be managed, Dominic. I need to be included. He held her gaze for a long, suspended moment. You're right, he said. I know. She turned back to the board. Tell me everything you have. I'll tell you what I've built. We'll put them together. They stayed in the archive room for an hour and 40 minutes. Side by side at a folding table, his files and her files spread between them, coffee going cold again, the city brightening outside windows they couldn't see from here. He really talked, the way she'd been waiting for him to, without the careful calibration, without the management. And she listened and asked questions and pushed back twice on his reasoning, and was right both times. And she watched him absorb that, accept it, build on it, the way a person did when they were in the presence of someone they actually trusted. At 9:05 a.m., Carver's voice came through Dominic's phone. The 8 o'clock called again. They've rescheduled to 9:30. We should go up, Nadia said. Yes. He didn't move immediately. He looked at her for a moment sideways, the way people looked at things they weren't ready to look at directly. Nadia, what I said last Friday about wanting the opportunity to be someone you chose. A pause. I meant that. I want you to know it wasn't strategy. It wasn't another arrangement. I know, she said. How do you know? She picked up her laptop. Because you're very good at strategy and very bad at this. She glanced at him and the corner of her mouth moved, which I find, for what it's worth, enormously reassuring. She walked out of the archive. Behind her, she heard him exhale a small sound, almost a laugh, the first completely unguarded sound she'd ever heard him make. She filed it away. I need a moment because this episode destroyed me in the best possible way. Like if you felt that. Subscribe because part 2 is the confrontation. She finds the full truth, he makes a declaration, and someone in the building makes their move. Comment below. Who do you think the leak is? I want your theories. Every single one.